One of the questions that rarely gets asked sincerely, but that's been put to me many times in my life in an insincere way, which is to say, a question that people have asked me presuming that there's no possible answer, is the question of why do we have philosophy at all? Why does philosophy exist? Why does philosophy exist in European culture? Why did it exist in, say, the culture of ancient India, of ancient China, of pre-modern Japan? Why does it exist today? Given that most of us start from the assumption now that we are basically a bipedal mammal, not so different from an ape, given the fact that we regard ourselves as animals that are primarily motivated by food, sleep, sex, shelter, such simple things, why is philosophy here among us? Why does it have the cultural and historical significance it does? Why does it even have the institutional significance that it does? So on and so forth. As I say, most people who ask this question ask it in an insincere way as a type of reproach. They ask it in a sense of demanding to know how anyone could possibly justify this, with the assumption that nobody could. And the people in my life who've asked me this at different stages since I was a teenager have normally been surprised that I do have an answer, and that my answer is somewhat sincere and humble and down to earth. The first plank of my answer is that I regard philosophy as a problem-solving method, or really philosophy in the plural as, many problem-solving methods, and even collecting these problem-solving methods together and engaging in a comparative study of one against the other. But the fundamental point is, if something does not have value as a problem-solving method, I do not think it belongs in the province of philosophy, in the category of philosophy. And I'll come back to that because that's one of the main, morals to this story here, is thinking about philosophy as something very different from religion, thinking of philosophy as something very different from propaganda, or even, ethical moralizing, preaching ethics is something very different from philosophy of ethics, analytical philosophy of ethics. There was a time in ancient Greece when the concept of a heliocentric solar system was proposed. Now, why? Why would anyone propose the idea that the sun was at the center of the solar system when they had a perfectly working model of the solar system that had the Earth at the center, and they had worked out all of the equations reasonably well to calculate the positions and distances and the timing of the orbits of the planets? Empirically, everyone already had a system of understanding the solar system that they were quite satisfied with. Now, I have never done the math for ancient Greece this way, but I have done the math for ancient India. And in ancient India, they had shockingly accurate calculations related to the orbit of the planets around the solar system. Now, I hesitate to even say orbit. We should hesitate even to say planet, because their concept of what the planets were was simply what you can see with the naked eye, with no telescope. These were dots. These were little glowing dots that you could see in the night sky that moved much more rapidly than the other stars. The other stars were relatively still, appeared relatively unmoving. And in India, they came up with these deadly accurate, shockingly accurate calculations and equations, so that, if you knew the position of any two of the planets, you knew the position of the other planets, so that you could record the time and date of events on Earth by noting down the positions of the planets on the azimuth and this kind of thing. They really, really worked out these equations to a tremendously fine point of accuracy. I believe it is down to fractions of a second, some of these equations. And again, I have seen some of that stuff that continued being used as a calendrical system, as a method of recording the time and date of significant events, even into basically early modern Myanmar in Southeast Asia. That tradition from India carried on. So I studied as part of the history of Theravada Buddhism, part of the history of Southeast Asia, part of the history of Sri Lanka too, obviously. So if everyone has a working system for understanding what the planets are and how they move in their orbits, why would a philosopher challenge this with the idea that the sun and not the earth ought to be in the center of the solar system. And empirically, everyone seems satisfied that they can vindicate the system they already have. Say, look, the equations make sense. The calculations work that we have. And the calculations are, in a sense, empirical. They are validated by what you can observe with the naked eye, with the motion of the planets from an Earth, from a terrestrial perspective, for lack of a better term. There has to be a sincere engagement with the question of what is the solar system from a problem-solving method. There's an onus on you to show, look, these equations, they have predictive power, they have accuracy, they're empirically valid, but they create some set of problems that are insoluble with the assumption that the Earth is in the center of the solar system, and that those problems are then resolved. They're solved if instead we try to make the math work with the assumption that it's the sun that's in the center of the solar system. So you guys probably know this. In ancient Greece, in ancient Athens, we have the record that this idea was proposed, it was debated, and it was ultimately discarded. The idea of the heliocentric universe really didn't get vindicated until many, many centuries later with Copernicus. And even then, as you may have heard, it was a bit of a struggle. People did not want to accept this idea that the sun was at the center of the solar system. In ancient India, I don't know if they really thought it through as a model of the solar system. Nothing I've read really indicates that. Their cosmology of what the planets were supposed to be is really another question. But as I said, they had these working equations. So this shows both the weakness and the strength of philosophy. In ancient Athens, they approached the question of the cosmology, of what is the universe, the cosmology of the world, how did the world arise, how it was created, from a philosophical perspective, from what they thought they ought to be, the significance of elements like fire and water, and whether or not fire ought to be in the center of the solar system, and so on. But the validity of the idea that the sun is in the center of the solar system, it has to be proposed and it has to be proven as a problem-solving method. If you can't show that there is a problem with the existing model and that this new idea solves the problem, then we're not really talking about philosophy. We're really just debating something much more like a religious ideal. Like, does it make more sense as a myth or a fable for us to imagine the sun being at the center of the solar system, or for us to imagine an orb, a sphere that's mostly water, being in the center of the solar system, like planet Earth? If it's just about symbolic values and mythological values and not about a problem-solving method, then even with something that's as empirically obvious as the way the solar system works, it still comes back to this question. And another subtle but pervasive question that comes out of ancient Athens. When Aristotle asks, what is the best system of government? Is he sincerely questioning? Is he actually proposing this as a problem and a problem to be solved? Is he actually investigating what is the best way for human beings to organize government? Or is he just engaging in propaganda to promote the government that happens to be the government of Athens? Now, in my own opinion, I don't think it's just propaganda. I think the reason why Aristotle's writing about politics has endured and still has value today was that he was really sincerely interested in solving problems, that he was conducting an inquiry into how human beings should organize government. And by contrast, just a few centuries later, you have an author like Cicero in Rome. And Cicero asks exactly the same question. He asks, what is the best form of government? But it is completely obvious that when Cicero asks and answers this question, it is 100% insincere propaganda for the glory of ancient Rome. All that Cicero is interested in telling you is that the government of the Roman Empire, at that time, not technically the empire in terms of how we use the terms today, but anyway, the government of Rome was the best possible system of government, even though it was just a product of random historical circumstances, that they had ended up with a better system of government than any of the other systems of government, whether in Greece or North Africa, Carthage, whatever comparison you wanted to make. And frankly, that insincerity takes Cicero's work out of the category of philosophy and puts it into the category of propaganda, even though ostensibly and at a surface level, it is asking and engaging with exactly the same problems that Aristotle asked in his Politics, and indeed one treatise is modeled on the other. So again, my sense is that the validity of something as philosophy stands or falls with it being a problem-solving method, and this answers the question of why we as hairless bipedal apes, why we created and why we have culturally this thing called philosophy. At some point, within the province of propaganda has to stop. And we have to ask these questions sincerely. And very often that's when we pass from politics into political philosophy. At some point, these religious questions have to stop just being cheerleading for one religious view or another. We have to ask them sincerely, and that's when we get into religious philosophy. And of course, it's really a very stark line in ethics. If you're just talking to a child, you may just tell that child what they ought to do. You may just tell the child what everyone in society ought to do to make society a better place. But if you're going to talk about ethics in a sincere way in terms of problem solving, once you get into ethical philosophy, then you're asking questions that you may genuinely not know the answer to. You're engaging in inquiry, and you're looking at the methods, the problem-solving methods that bring us to those different conclusions. And ultimately, the validity of a system of ethics and philosophy is not whether or not it convinces people to be moral. Because of course, you can just go around still in a mainstream religion like Islam, they just tell people to do things that they consider morally good, because if they don't, they'll go to hell after they die. So obviously, if it's just about inculcating a habit of mind into people that's going to produce socially desirable consequences, any kind of lie, any kind of insincere belief, tenet, or philosophy could stand. But precisely when we move from religion and propaganda into the province of real philosophy, that has to be when we're questioning something that I think in an important sense is different from questioning what is the truth. We're questioning what is the problem, how do we solve the problem, and then what is the validity or invalidity of these problem-solving methods. So guys, that's what I have to say in this video. The context from my recording this video today is that I just made, last night at 2:30 a.m., when I couldn't fall asleep, I made a relatively brief video talking about the philosophy of determinism. And I didn't say clearly in that video, I added in the caption, the written text below the video, I said, look, why do I call determinism a pseudo-philosophy? I call determinism a pseudo-philosophy because I do not see it as sincerely trying to solve a problem. I don't see it as having problem-solving value. I see it more as a kind of myth, a religious mythology. And the main defense I hear again and again from determinists is, no, the fact that they believe that a criminal doesn't have any choice before committing a crime, that doesn't matter, that doesn't change anything. The description of the world is just the same. No, the fact that I can't control, the dilation of the pupil of my eye, whereas I can control things I consciously do. No, that distinction doesn't matter. That's just subjective. That's just something you perceive. Nevertheless, this remains true. Well, what is the problem that this solves? Because you've presented a theory that to a much greater extent than the heliocentric solar system, to a much greater extent than the idea that the sun is at the center of the solar system, the people who believe in determinists have proposed a theory that contradicts something empirically obvious to all of us. What's empirically obvious is that we make choices, that we make decisions, that we think about the future, that we imagine the future, and that when we're engaged in imagining what we might do about the future, we are doing something with our mind that is much different from the way the mind controls the dilation of the pupil, which is to say, I don't consciously control it. There's a cause and effect relationship. If I turn off this light, my pupil will dilate one way. If I make the light brighter, my pupil will dilate the other way, and I have no way to control that. I have no way to do it. I have no choice in the matter. That's an involuntary reaction in a cause and effect way. They're claiming that everything we do with our bodies and our minds is, in this sense, determined in a cause and effect way. Well, what is the problem that you're sincerely trying to solve? Ultimately, the heliocentric model of the solar system had to win. the math could work either way. You actually could come up with equations that accurately predicted the timing of the motions of all the planets without understanding that the sun was at the center of the solar system. You could make the math work. But the heliocentric model of the universe, from a sincere problem-solving point of view, and you think about Occam's razor and so on, it's a simpler and more coherent account of why and how those equations work out. It explains a lot of things like, one of the real ones the ancient world struggled with is what is an eclipse? A solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse, those get really hard to explain if you don't believe in a heliocentric solar system. There were some things like this that really raised troublesome questions, even when you were just making observations without a telescope with the naked eye. And when people were not necessarily imagining that these glowing dots in the sky were actually planets similar to planet Earth, they probably were not even imagining the Earth as a sphere. Kind of a long story about ancient cosmology and what their assumptions were. So real philosophy is ultimately, I think, not even a search for truth. It's not ultimately about epistemology or metaphysics, but the type of sincerity that philosophy requires is the attitude of solving problems. And you can see you cross a dotted line, because if you sit down in the real world of politics, you may have some particular biased outcome you're trying to achieve. You may be trying to make the world a better place. You may be trying to avert a war. You may be trying to avert starvation. And in order to achieve those goals, you may involve yourself in any number of lies, deceptions, skullduggery. You may not be interested in the truth, and you may not be interested in philosophy. And indeed, I think some of the worst catastrophes in human history have happened for that reason, because people had what they thought were good intentions, and in many ways did indeed pave the way to hell, as the old saying goes, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And philosophy remains this category that stands outside of the other disciplines precisely because of the attention paid to the discipline itself, the function of the problem-solving method, and the comparative analysis of those problem-solving methods.